Alrighty, take two. So this is a little presentation on my method for extracting value from literature. So here we are, some goals. The first step is to identify relevant literature. Sounds obvious, but you really need to understand what papers are relevant to you and to your thesis, and not read way too broadly, but make sure you're covering all your bases, which we'll get through over time. Pardon me. Extract the valuable ideas. That's the second goal. So that means reading through a paper and extracting exactly what you need, what can contribute to your thesis. Maybe providing a little bit more, so writing down a bit more than you use, having some to throw away, that's completely fine. But understanding that a paper doesn't have to be perfectly related to your thesis, as we'll get into. It can still have valuable ideas. And then we need to extract those valuable ideas and then generate original critical thought. So we need to be able to take those ideas and then evaluate them. And I need to write comments that are my own words. So I need to be able to read a paper, for instance, as we're going to do now, and break it down, extract the valuable ideas, and generate some of my own opinions, basically. And then I need to repeat that process many, many times. I'm estimating that I'll need to read about 150 to 200 papers because my project is so broad. So my project is on hormones, and we're measuring those hormones in wool. So we really need to understand some relevant keywords. You can't really perform a literature search if you don't know what you're searching for, really. Here's a list of 12 or so, maybe 16 keywords that are relevant. So we have things like heat stress, climate, wool yield, the HPA axis, hair, wool strength, cortisol, testosterone, RAMs, hormone levels, fleece. These are really independent and critical themes that will appear throughout my project. Another thing that we'll eventually do down the track is break these keywords into themes. Into smaller themes. So one's related to hormones specifically, one's related to animal welfare if we get to that point, talking about heat stress. And then one's talking about the wool side of things, and then the climate side of things. So the first thing you need to do, once you know your keywords, is you need to refine your search. So I'm using Google Scholar. Basically, you throw a couple keywords in there, different combinations of these keywords, and then you can refine by time. This is a very important tool. So you don't, when running my literature review, at least the way I'm approaching it, is I don't need papers that were written in 2023. We're only basically 1 month into the year already, and I don't need the most, at least I need thought from before then. I need to show how, what I'm looking at, how the monitoring of hormones through fleece or through wool, hair, has changed over time, and how that method actually works from a biochemical level. So that is a very important tool. So I can cast back to results from the 50s, for instance, and understand, all right, what do we know about hair back then? About 70 years ago. So yeah, that being able to refine your search is a very critical tool. Second is to seek the keywords. So the keywords I've used here are measuring hormones in hair. So I used hair because it's a general term. I'm specifically looking at fleece, so that's a little bit, it's a bit rarer. So I'm trying to find as much literature as I possibly can. This search came back with 126,000 results. So that's a lot, but if I'd done wool, it probably would have been fewer. So here's 3 papers that I've found. So I can see in the actual headings that the keywords are bold. So the keywords that I put into the search bar have come up bold. So they're already showing those, but I'm looking for other links, other words that I haven't told the search that I'm looking for, just to prove that it can show me what I actually want. So the first one, it says down here, measuring cortisol in hair. So it's brought up cortisol, even though I didn't mention anything about cortisol. So that's interesting. This paper is in a forensic science journal, so it necessarily probably isn't going to be animal related, more likely human related. It doesn't mean it's not relevant. It just means that I'm searching quite broadly at this point. The next paper is talking about wildlife hair. So that's one step closer. It's not exactly rams, but it's likely wild animals. So that's something that could be of value. And then the last one talks about clinical applications of cortisol measurement. So that is likely talking about human medicine once again. However, doesn't mean it's not valuable, because we're all mammals at the end of the day, at least the animals I'm looking at. So once you know your keywords, I can't count, but you then need to skim the abstract. So of these papers, you'd find one. So for instance, I'd find this one. When I found this paper, the same method, same way I did it, look for my keywords, a novel method using hair for determining hormone levels in wildlife. So it's got the word hair, it's got hormone levels in wildlife, it's a novel method. This paper's quite early, 2001, 2002, depending where you source the paper from. So it's quite novel at this point. So I'm, at least from looking at the heading, looking at the title, deeming this as valuable. Then it goes on to the next step, which is to skim the abstract. So I'm going to read the abstract. In this case, there is no abstract, so I'm just going to have a quick read of the introduction, maybe a quick read of the conclusion. If I'm looking at the first maybe paragraph, second paragraph of the introduction very, very quickly, and it's not valuable, there's probably no reason to look at the conclusion. However, I deemed this paper was valuable, so we went on to the next step. Really, as I've written up here in the top right, the most important part here is to deem, is this paper relevant to my keywords? It has keywords in it, in the heading, and the first sentence is very relevant to what I'm looking at. I could imagine my project, Lit Review, having a very similar first sentence, or very similar content at least. So the next step I need to do is create a list of papers where I have read the headings, they have keywords, or at least they're relevant, there's some value in there. I've read the abstract or the first few sentences, paragraphs, whatever it may be, conclusion of the paper, and I deem it relevant. It goes on to the fifth step, which is to write a list of vetted papers. So these are all papers that at some point I have to get around to reading in some greater detail. So I've deemed these papers to be valuable and to have created questions that I think are interesting. So here we've got one, the first paper, so this one here. Then I have another paper that is looking at different sample types. So it's looking at blood, saliva, fecal, and wool tissues. And then we have another one looking at cortisol and testosterone. So both the hormones I'm looking at in hair, in obese and non-obese human subjects. So this is interesting. It's not necessarily animal production, animal related, wildlife related. It's more human, but I dare say there's still going to be some interesting things in there, and I can definitely, at the worst case, look at their methodology. So how they were assessing these hormones and how they were processing their hair samples. Step 2. So if step 1 was to find these papers, step 2 is, after creating a list of vetted papers, is to read the introduction. So introductions are valuable as they show how other researchers, other authors, have summarized ideas relevant to your work. And the best way I could summarize this, the importance of introductions, at least in most cases, is that their carefully vetted papers are relevant idea summaries. Once again, carefully vetted papers, or the introductions of these carefully vetted papers, are relevant idea summaries. That's basically what an introduction is. So you're going to be able to, if you read a lot of introductions about a particular field, there's something maybe you don't know about, you're going to learn the basics quite quickly. So here's the introduction. It's quite short for the particular paper I'm looking at, and then we're going to dive in. So as you can see here, the references all come up in blue. So there's quite a few, and then I'll show you what I would normally do. So here's a particular paragraph, I think it's the second paragraph down here, that talks about the limitations. So how we would be testing, or what samples we would be using to test for hormones, and the sort of limitations. So this first reference here is at the end of a sentence that says, hormones are usually extracted from blood samples or non-invasively from saliva, urine, and feces. So I want to look at this 1992 paper. I think that's really relevant. It's talking about the different methods we used. It's the earliest, I believe, of these citations here. So it's talking about these techniques before these other authors have. So I really want to look at that. Likely the same paper, I'm not actually sure, also comes down here and says, it's linked to this sentence that says samples derived from trapped or handled animals are problematic because stress may alter blood and urine hormone levels. So this is once again referenced because it's a different idea. So up here they were talking about these are the different tissues that we can sample to get to and extract hormones from, and here we have a disadvantage or a limitation of one particular method. So that is the blood method or the urine method also. And then we have another paper down here by Yang from the late 90s that talks about further limitations. So I would have read this introduction at least once, and I'm going through and identifying these critical references that I really want to go look up again. What someone who is rushing might do is just read this paper once, and then, for instance, if they wanted to talk about limitations here, so Yang mentions that blood and saliva must be transported cold or frozen, and those conditions might not be feasible in the field. So some paraphrase that, according to Yang et al., 1998, blood may not be a viable option in some field studies, as it has to be transported frozen. You could do that. It may be an option if you're rushing, if you trust that source, but I want to go back to the source and read it directly. So here, this is how I'm organizing my ideas. So at the top here, I have the paper we've been looking at, a novel method using hair for determining hormone levels in wildlife. And then I have the 3 references that are underlined here in green, and I've generated a question from each of them. So one thing I've done in the past is I will find a paper, such as Yang's paper, and I will just write down everything from the introduction all the way to the conclusion, any relevant dot points, and I will organize them by maybe a theme in the paragraph. So if Yang was talking about urine at one point, and then blood, and then fecal cortisol, for instance, I would have them in different settings, in different under different headings. The problem that exists with that is that it doesn't, whilst it links ideas roughly together, it doesn't allow me to link other ideas from other authors. So as you can see here, the first source or citation I've underlined talks about how are hormones measured in animal tissues. So, well, they're measured through these different samples, so saliva, urine, and feces. So that's the answer to that question. So I'm basically trying to find the correct answer to the question. So the literature right here provides me with an answer. The authors of this paper have summarized other authors to get these answers, and now I'm just asking the questions back. Now, if I can ask these questions as accurately as possible, I believe I'm hypothesizing that I will be able to write a very long list of questions, which I can all answer in my literature review. And if I can do that, then I completely understand my topic. Likely the same reference, same paper, at least the same year, talks about here the limitations of using the blood and urine method. So if you're handling an animal, that's going to stress it out likely, and you're going to sort of ruin your sample. So what are the restrictions to hormone? What restrictions to hormone measuring exist? So that's one. Yeah, if you're going to test cortisol, for instance, one of the stress hormones, or what's known as the stress hormone, in, I don't know, caged feral cats, for instance, you may want to not use blood cortisol or a blood sample, because it's likely that the act of catching that cat is going to stress it out and ruin the sample. So if you're trying to look at like how koalas, for instance, survive bushfires, and you are actively catching them and stressing them out, then there's going to be some potential issues with that sample. And then Yang also raises another point that there are there's sort of limitations with these methods, restrictions. It can't be used in all applications. So the good thing about this method is that one question can be answered by multiple authors. And in my opinion, this is how you end up with multiple sources per one question. So this is asking, basically providing the answer to a question, and these are the sources of those answers. So these are the people who have gone out and done the work to provide the answers. But yeah, basically this is my method that I want to use. The idea is that one paper will provide me with many, many questions. So one paper provides many answers or citations, and I'm the one asking the questions as accurate as my questions will be, will determine how quickly and how thoroughly I understand this base of literature. The more questions I ask of the literature, so what, for instance, what is this reference over here? I've chopped the image off, but I can't tell. What is Woodruff here? What is he saying or she saying? An alternative source for hormones may be found in hair, which can be collected non-invasively and is already extracted in DNA. So I could use this to say, Woodruff. So I would write Woodruff, 1993, role of or alternatives for alternative tissues, for instance, and one of those alternative tissues for hormone assessment, and one of those is hair. So I'm asking questions of the literature, and the answers are manifesting themselves because that's what scientists do. They provide the results. So I'm going to ask myself many of these questions through the literature, get the answers, and ask the reference what it's telling me. And then over time, through group meetings and whatnot, people asking me questions about my thesis, I'm able to identify holes. So if someone asks me, how is cortisol made during summer, or how does heat stress affect testosterone production in rams, I need to be able to answer these questions. And the way I need to come across these answers is by questioning the literature and basically looking for the answers and piecing them together. That's the end of this presentation, but next time I'm going to be stepping through how I would understand a method section. So this paper not only has valuable research from the authors, but it also has valuable research from all the authors that provided information for this literature review or this introduction. So all these authors in blue have provided information, and it's my job to, as I said before back here, extracting the valuable ideas not only from the paper I'm reading, but also from who that author deemed valuable themselves. And if I do that enough over time at scale, I reckon that I will produce a nice summary subset of different, the most valuable ideas provided by the most valuable of authors. And yeah, I believe that is it. Too easy.